There are two types of mouse outbreaks. Unfortunately, there are the ones that we call a 1-year outbreak, and they develop very rapidly, and mice get to really high numbers and then crash away to almost zero very quickly. And in fact, what happens is my phone starts to ring and farmers say to me, what's happened to all my mice? They've just disappeared really suddenly. Or the other type is you get a sort of a gradual increase through the first year of the outbreak, then you get a high level of overwinter survival, and then if the following spring is really favourable for mouse breeding, then those numbers go exponential in the second spring. One of the things that's really important to know about mice is that they're breeding machines. So they start breeding when they're 6 weeks old, and they can have a litter of 6 to 10 pups every 19 to 21 days after that. So while they've give birth to their first litter, and this is the real kicker in the system, so they give birth to their first litter, they then fall pregnant straight away after that. And so while they're rearing the first litter in the nest, they're gestating the second litter, and as soon as they get rid of the first litter, they give birth to the second litter. So there's no gap in production through time. And one of the figures that's in the scientific literature is a single pair of mice can give rise to 500 offspring over the course of a season. So if we get a high level of overwinter survival and they start breeding in the subsequent spring from a high population base, so more animals in the population, more animals breeding, that rate of increase is way more rapid in the second spring. So we're trying to minimise the rate of survival through winter, and cold, wet winters are things that lead to lower levels of survival. But if that's not the case, we need to be monitoring mice right through the spring and as the crop develops, so we can be reducing the numbers of mice in the lead up to the spring to try and take the top off that breeding potential. One of the questions I often get, what impact will this big rainfall event have on the mice? Or if we get some really good frosts, that'll clean them up, won't it? And one of the really interesting things that's happened in the lead up to Easter this year, there was a major rainfall event through southern Queensland and northern New South Wales that in some cases caused flooding, but in a lot of cases just took the soil moisture to saturation. And when I spoke to farmers after this rainfall event, their feeling was that the rainfall event had slowed down the mice a bit, but certainly hadn't wiped them out. And so what we think's happened is that any burrows that were flooded would have accounted for any offspring, highly dependent offspring that were down in those burrows but couldn't get out, so they all would have drowned. But the level of adult survival still would have been quite high, particularly in farming systems where pasture is a large component of the system, because in those areas we're getting reports of really high numbers of mice in pastures where there was really high levels of shelter and a chance for mice to get out of those really wet conditions in the stubbles. So while it has that major rainfall event has checked numbers, it certainly hasn't wiped them out. The other question we get about is frosts. And of course, frosts are a wintertime activity, and the perception that frosts actually slow the mice down, it probably comes about because as we go into the winter and the weather gets colder and the day length gets shorter and there are less resources in the system, mouse breeding slows down, and so we're getting frosts. The number of mice breeding is reduced, and so the perception is that the frost is actually dealing with the mice. It's probably just coincidental, and we know that if these burrows are 30 and 50 centimetres deep, they're pretty good, comfortable places to live, and mice will persist under a whole range of conditions. That's another important point to get across, is we often hear about mice moving across the landscape in a wave, but that's not really what's happening. Mice are really small critters, and moving for a mouse is actually quite a dangerous thing to do. So what drives a mouse to move is a lack of food, basically. So as mouse numbers get high and the food in one area gets depleted, they just move by degrees to different locations to find more food. but they're not actively making a decision to migrate or move large distances. So we've got to be really careful about continuing to monitor, because the rate of breeding in mice is just so high, and by the time you've detected you've got a problem, it can be almost too late.